You know, it seems like every time you go on Twitter, you look at your news feeds, you turn on the news, you hear this on the radio. It just seems like there's always something new hitting your ears, your eyes about what's new in nutrition, what's good for you, what's bad for you. And if it seems that way to you, it's because it's 100% true. My guest today has been keeping track of all of this, has such a well organized archive of all of these new studies that have been coming out. And he's going to be talking about a slew of them here on the show today. He is the director of cardiovascular prevention and wellness at National Jewish Health. And I would consider him a close personal friend. Dr. Andrew Freeman, welcome back to the exam room, my friend.
Well, thanks so much for having me again. It's nice to be back and for that lovely intro. Wow, I'm starting to blush here.
Is it safe to say that we are learning more now, more than ever, about the effect that food has on our body?
It's amazing to me. You bring up some good points. First, most of us as physicians barely know how much data is published every year. They barely know how much research is out there that is coming out new every year. And so you can only imagine that the public doesn't know. And of course, with big food and big pharma and a number of other industry influences, much of the data gets suppressed. So it's an important point to spend time getting to know this data and learning about it. And that's what I try to bring to the public. But it is eye-opening just how much there is each and every year.
Is it possible to even quantify, like if you had to take a guess at the number of nutrition studies that have been published, say, over the past 12 months, what would you peg that at?
It's a great question because some of these studies, have nutrition components. And so it's hard to know. My guess is it's in the hundreds worldwide. And what I'm planning on presenting at ICNM is going to be just a sampling of what I think is probably the best data.
Just a sampling. Okay, here's a preview. Let me just peel back the curtain a little bit for those of you who have not yet registered for the International Conference on Nutrition and Medicine. This man says just a sliver. He may have the longest presentation of the entire conference. I think that his PowerPoint, it's somewhere in the ballpark of 90 slides. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I'm from the East Coast originally, so I talk quickly. But my hope is not to read the slide verbatim, but rather, to really shock and educate about just how powerful the data really is.
All right, well, let's get into some of them. I don't think we're going to cover all 90 on the program today, but we're going to do our best to get to a good number of them. Let me start, though, by asking you this. Some of the studies that you referenced, they don't necessarily show a cause, but they do show a significant relationship. Before we get going, can you talk to us about the difference between those two things?
It's interesting. A lot of us believe that, a certain thing causes a certain other thing in medicine. But we have to be really careful when we publish as researchers. Typically, we have to list that there's an association, right? So there's an association that if I wear a seatbelt and get into a car accident, I probably won't get killed. But who's going to do the study that proves that, right? It all is common sense. So sometimes we have associations versus proof. And then sometimes with enough study and enough research and the statistical methods and overall research methods done well, you can show proof. What I usually tell people is in the nutrition world, there's a combination of proof and association that really shows that a predominantly low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet really improves outcomes on a variety of fronts, both cancer and heart disease, which is what my field is, in addition to a whole variety of other ones, as will be displayed today and also when I give my talk.
And I think that when people think about nutrition, one of the first things that they may think about is obesity, right? You eat high fat foods, you eat high calorie foods, you're going to gain weight. And then we often hear about the trends in obesity. More and more people are packing on the pounds. Recently, what have those trends been showing? I know that this is going to be a big part of your presentation.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, the CDC publishes this. So it's interesting. The Centers for Disease Control, CDC, is now spending much more effort on non-communicable diseases, right? Not communicable diseases, right? So, of course, they're spending time on COVID and all that since we have just sort of started to emerge from that pandemic. But by and large, the thing that still kills people the most is heart disease, right? So, so they put together some amazing statistics. And they, each year they publish it, and it's a couple of years late. But in 2018, the obesity rate in the United States was 42%. My guess is when 2020 comes out, especially with the sort of pandemic eating that has been going on, I suspect it'll be well over 50%. And we're also starting to see trends in particular demographics. For instance, nearly 60% of non-Hispanic Black women were obese, and adults between age 40 and 59 had the highest rates of obesity and severe obesity. So we're seeing our population become very large in size, not necessarily number. It's interesting, the fertility rates also are lower. That's a different topic, and we can maybe talk about that if you wanted to. But I think we're in trouble with the obesity rates. And, obesity costs an enormous amount of money every year in terms of healthcare and lost productivity.
And let me preface this next question by saying all of the studies, again, that we're going to be talking about here today, I would say at most have been within the last 18 months, right? So that's about as far back as we're going to go during this discussion. Now, you talk about obesity, you think about BMI. The higher the BMI, the more likely the person is to have obesity. But I know that there was a study that looked at the average BMI of somebody who eats a lot of animal products, right? So they eat more meat, they eat more fish, more dairy, more eggs. And then they looked at that BMI and compared it to the BMI of somebody who ate far less of that, maybe even a strictly vegetarian or vegan diet. What did they find in this particular study?
So in short, this is not news, right? I would argue there's been probably dozens of studies over the last several years that show that when you eat a predominantly plant-based diet, you tend to not only lose weight, but keep it off. And so there was a study that was done not too long ago in Germany. And basically, if you ate fewer animal products, you had a lower BMI. And again, I think this is just more proof. And this is what I always tell people that give me, grief. Oh, well, that's just an association. Well, there's a lot of signal in whatever noise may be perceived. And I think it's time we really start paying attention. And on top of that, our environment is in peril. This is not in my talk, but you may have seen that for the first time in ever, Siberia last week was like 118 degrees, right? And a lot of that has to do with what we do every day that we take for granted, like our diets. So in short, bottom line is BMI and eating a predominantly plant-based diet has always been in a very positive correlation, meaning eating this way keeps people thinner longer.
Let me talk to you about that, what you were just talking about from the environment and the temperature from the standpoint of a former big guy, right? I used to loathe the summer. The larger I was, the more I hated the heat. And the funny thing is, you just hit the nail on the head. The very same foods that I was eating that kept me in that large frame are the very same ones that also kept me in that extremely hot summer heat, and that was just uncomfortable. So kind of did it to myself. Well, certainly, contributed in that way. And that's an association that I think only now are people on a larger scale finally trying or starting to understand that it's not just food. Like it's your health and your body, it's the health of the environment, it's so many things. It's bigger than one person, I'll put it to you that way.
Well, yeah, and just to reiterate that, and actually last year there was a whole slew of articles on environmental health in major journals, New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet, and these worldwide journals that everybody reads. The truth is we can no longer separate the environment and our health. We live in our environment. We live in this planet. When the planet has an unhealthy environment, we don't have a healthy environment. And so what a lot of people don't associate is, well, they're like, well, I'm in it for the cardiology, or I'm in it for the cancer reduction, or I'm in it for animal welfare. Those are all important, don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, if you have an environment that doesn't sustain life, it doesn't matter for anybody, right? I mean, we're all in trouble. So I think we have to be smart about what we do. And every year the evidence just continually compounds, which is what I'm just showing about how quickly we need to make these changes. But I would tell you, and because you didn't see me speak last year, I did a whole discussion about this, but by 2030, which is not that long away, we could have a significant rise in temperature, which leads to more insect-borne diseases and more heat-related diseases. There may be more water-borne diseases because much of our country may be underwater. I mean, it keeps going. So we are in trouble. We need to make these changes for our health, for our future, for our kids, grandkids, everybody.
Kind of news that picks you up and makes you feel good, right?
Sadly. But, doing something about it does make you feel good, I think.
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. And that's why we do the show. It's to educate the person who is watching, and then hopefully they can take this information and pass it on, right? I mean, it's all about paying it forward. Let's bump down to another study. This was an interesting one. It was 20 people that researchers looked at, and it pitted low-fat plant-based diets versus low-carb diets, put them head-to-head, right? So essentially a vegan or vegetarian diet versus the keto diet. This was, I think they did 2 weeks of each. So you start with one and then you flip to the other. What did researchers discover there in terms of health?
It was interesting. They kind of put them through both phases, but people who were on the low-fat plant-based diet actually consumed 700 fewer daily calories, and both felt satiety, meaning that they were full. They felt satisfied on the diet. Both groups have lost weight, and that's true anytime you cut out a lot of the garbage that people eat. But people felt satisfied on this approach, which I think is difficult for people to realize. I mean, I take care of patients all the time, and they say, "Doc, if I eat that rabbit food, I'm never going to feel full." And of course, that's not true if it's done well.
It's so interesting to me that when somebody asks, "Well, what do you eat on this plant-based diet? Aren't you hungry?" All the time, I'm like, "Man, I've never been more full in my life." There are times when I will back away from the table, and I don't try to eat past full. Like I try to be a very mindful eater, but there are still times when I will push away from the table, and I will feel almost as full as I did when I would spend $20 at Taco Bell back in the day. Like it's just the volume of fiber. That's the only thing I can think of that really just it hits you, and you're super full, you're super satiated, and then like you said, you look at the caloric difference and it's like, oh my God, night and day. I only ate this many calories versus that many calories back in the day. Why wasn't I doing this sooner?
It's calorie density, and people don't realize it. The way I equate this is I'll tell my patient, I know that you are used to eating the cow or the pig or the chicken, but I want you to eat like them. And I said to them, the cow spends all day eating grass and concentrates the calories, and then we take a shortcut and eat it. Where do you think all those calories are going to go? And they're like, oh, I guess that makes sense, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you talk about calorie density. That brings us to another one of the studies I wanted to talk to you about, and this one is about olive oil. Now, in the plant-based community, especially the deeper you get into it, oil is a hot topic, man. Some people say it's okay in a little bit. Some people say you shouldn't have a drop whatsoever. But you took a look at a particular study that was released on olive oil. And let me read you what researchers concluded here. This had to do with olive oil and cardiovascular risk. It said, quote, higher olive oil intake was associated with lower risk of CHD and CVD. So you're talking about chronic heart disease and cardiovascular disease. And then they go on to say, here's where it gets interesting to me, Dr. Freeman. Quote, the substitution of margarine, butter, mayonnaise, and dairy fat with olive oil could lead to a lower risk of both of those diseases. So my question is, well, wouldn't the risk be even lower without any of that fat whatsoever if there was no oil there either?
It's a great question. So this was actually in the premier cardiology journal, JACC, the Journal of the Association, American College of Cardiology, sorry. And it was nearly 100,000 people that were included. So, it turns out if you take the stuff that we know is bad, margarines, butters, mayonnaise, and you put in olive oil, which is predominantly plant-based, people seem to do better from a heart disease perspective. And I would also tell you that oil is a kind of an interesting thing, and it's a loaded topic. If you look at most oils, you take these little itty bitty seeds, you put enormous pressure, enormous heat to extract a couple of drops of oil out of them. The exception is olive oil, right? You can take an olive and squeeze it with your fingers, and out comes oil, right? Or olive juice, some people call it. Now, that said, it's a minimally processed product, and it appears to contain some very beneficial compounds for cardiovascular health. But I would also tell you that there's other data published about oils and fats that they are very concentrated sources of fats, so much so that when your body gets them in their sort of isolated form without the matrix of the plant that they live in, your body doesn't really know what to do. And sometimes you create triglycerides, and it can actually affect cholesterol and a number of other things. And then on the bench research, especially if you look at the work from Esselstyn and others, they would tell you that it is potentially harmful to endothelial cells, which line blood vessels. So it would have been nice to see another arm of the study where they had them on, almost no fat and see how they did, because I suspect they may have done better perhaps. But I guess my advice for my patients is typically that if they're going to consume some sort of fatty type substance, olive oil or even canola oil appears to have the safest track record. But if you're high risk for cardiovascular disease, I usually tell people to go very low fat to either avoid it or eliminate it altogether. So bottom line is, it's an interesting study, and it's sort of a no-brainer to me. You take a block of lard or butter or whatever, and you give them olive oil. Okay, people do better. Great. The question is, if you cut out the fat altogether, especially in the higher risk people, would they do better? And I suspect the answer would be yes.
I would think so too. Where do you stand on palm and or coconut oil? Those two seem to be the real big culprits of saturated fat.
Yeah, so I actually never recommend coconut oil. It's interesting. Coconut oil actually has more saturated fat than lard, which is hard for people to realize. And it is decadent. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had it, but it is incredibly decadent. That said, it's not good for you. In fact, it's highly associated with atherosclerosis. In fact, the American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association guidelines specifically say that if you consume oil, to consume non-tropical oils, which would be, say, coconut. That said, coconut topically for your skin is excellent, except if you live in a place like Denver or, the Dakotas or wherever, where when it hits the cold pipes, it congeals and causes a major plumbing problem. And then palm oil, has a whole bunch of ethical issues associated with it, and also doesn't necessarily appear to be safe for the same reasons. So in general, I usually recommend avoiding those. Again, the oils that have some amount of data behind them really remain olive, canola, and you might make an argument for safflower, sunflower. The rest of them probably not helpful. Some of them may be quite harmful. And I don't think we have enough data to really know, is it safe for some people who might be at lower risk versus those at higher risk? That type of study hasn't really been done in any great sort of scrutinizing way.
I never thought, I honestly had a hard time focusing on anything else after you pointed out that, that the oil will harden in the drain and cause a plumbing problem. I never thought of that, and it makes all the sense in the world to me. Were you saying that from experience?
No, although I do have patients and colleagues who have had such experience. These days, if you buy products that are, hair products or soaps or whatever, they're made from coconut oil, usually you'll be okay. But if you're taking like the, Costco tub of coconut oil to the shower, and some people do all sorts of things to keep their hair moisturized and whatever, you could end up with trouble. So just make sure you have plenty of flushing water for it, I suppose. It's sort of like putting grease down the drain when you were probably little, right? People said, don't do that. This is the same reason.
Gotcha. Again, all the sense in the world, all the sense in the world. Okay, so oil, a hot topic. Red meat, not so much. It seems like there's a lot of consensus when it comes to the health risks associated with red meat. Let's look at this one particular study you're going to be talking about. 37,000 Americans were included in this one, and they compared the health of those who were red meat addicts. They just couldn't get enough. And then the health of those who kind of swore off of red meat a lot more. What did they discover in this one? I mean, 37,000 people, that's a pretty good sample size.
Yeah, although it's interesting, if you look at some of the cardiology studies that are done with many of the drugs we use, there are always hundreds of thousands of people. But that said, of course, this is a very large study. And those who ate the most plant protein compared to those who ate the least were 27% less likely to die of any cause and 29% less likely to die from heart disease. But interestingly, if you replace just 5% of the calories of animal protein with an equal number of calories from plant protein, you had a 50% decreased risk for dying from any cause, including heart disease. And if you got rid of 2% of the processed red meat, which we know is really bad news, 32% less death. And I want to point out, you cannot get the magnitude of a result from any drug that I know of like this. If I said to you, hey, take this pill, it'll give you 50% less chance of dying, I couldn't keep it on the shelves probably forever. And here it is. It's on the shelves right now. It's fruits and vegetables, right? So, people need to just to hear this. But here's the crazy thing. Studies like this have been done for decades and have showed similar magnitude results. So I think it's time we really start paying attention. And I really wish, frankly, especially on processed red meat, when you go to buy that hot dog at Costco or wherever you go, that it comes with a warning label, warning this may kill you, enjoy, right?
And as we tape this, it was just a few days ago that Nathan's had their big annual hot dog eating contest. And I always wonder, what is happening to these people's bodies for the next week? What is happening to their long-term risk for developing cancer, heart disease, something like that? I mean, you got to figure you're eating somewhere in the ballpark of 70 hot dogs in the span of 10 minutes. That's not healthy on any planet at any time ever.
Although it is quite a marvel to see these people do it. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you can pull it off. My only hope is that they're very rapidly eliminated from their bodies because they are toxins for sure. A lot of people, have posited over the years, why is processed red meat so toxic? Well, the truth is it moves through the colon on its way out of the body. And when you don't eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, that transit time is slower. So the toxins are in contact with the colon wall for longer. It's sort of like, if you smoke one cigarette, it probably won't get you, but if you smoke every day, it probably will get you. It's sort of that exposure time that seems to be dangerous. That said, I can only imagine what their cholesterol is transiently and all these other things that I would never, you can only imagine. And further, I can't even imagine, what this does to their GI tract. I really can't.
That can't be, it can't be pleasant. It just can't be pleasant. So there were a lot of studies on red meat that have come out, and I'm sure that there are more in the pipeline as well. Another one that you looked at the connection between red meat and diabetes, which to me is interesting because you think about diabetes, you think about sugar. I'm not sure how many people actually consider red meat being a factor in diabetes. What did this particular study find?
Well, just to kind of refresh everybody's sort of memories, back in the 1940s, Walter Kempner at Duke was treating diabetes with the white rice and fruit diet. Now, it may seem weird to feed a diabetic basically sugar-containing fruits and vegetables and white rice, which is effectively a processed carbohydrate. But diabetes is really a disease of fat excess. And so when you get fatty deposits in the muscles, the liver, when you eat sugary things or things that break down to sugar readily, your receptors can't come out and eat up that sugar so well. And so your sugar stays high. So, when people say, well, I can't eat carbs because my sugar goes out of whack, well, there's truth to that. But then the question is, why and how do we get to the root cause of that? And that's where cutting out the fat is. And remember, red meat is fatty, right? And so in this study, it was a meta-analysis of 28 manuscripts, investigations. And it basically said that those who consumed the most total meat, red meat, and processed meat increased their diabetes by up to 33%. So that's incredible. And diabetes is on the rise, right? Roughly half of Americans have diabetes at this point, or pre-diabetes. And believe it or not, an extra 100 grams, which is not a very big portion, it's probably a hot dog or less, of total meat or red meat increased the risk by 36% or more, which is just incredible to think about. And then if you ate processed red meat, particularly a hot dog, just 50 grams increased the risk of diabetes by 46%, almost 50% increase. So in short, I think we really need to start calling out foods for what they are, but this may be potentially dangerous.
Yeah, but somebody right now could be hearing this, doc, and they're like, okay, well, of course a hot dog is fatty. Of course prime rib is fatty, but there is lean cuts of red meat out there. What would your reply to that be?
Well, I would say first, lean means there's less fat, but it's not no fat, A. And B, there's just a bunch of harmful things in red meat. Whether it's the breakdown products that turn into TMAO, transmethylamine oxide, which I've spoken about before, or if it's something else, there's a lot of stuff in our food, and it's concentrated. Toxins are concentrated as we go up in the food chain. And so, who knows what it is? Fat may only be part of the equation.
All right, let's continue on. There was another study. You just mentioned the gentleman from Duke back in the day who fed people white rice and fruit. But then there's this new data that came out looking at fruit consumption and diabetes. What is this new data showing us?
Yeah, I mean, it actually showed that people who ate the most fruit or vegetables in the cohort that was studied had a 50% less likelihood of developing diabetes. And in fact, just 66 grams a day more fruit and vegetables was associated with a quarter lower risk of diabetes. So it's a very interesting study. But again, I would tell you, fruit and vegetables are not the enemy of diabetes. In fact, just a couple of years ago now, the ADA, the American Diabetes Association, actually endorses a fully plant-based diet.
Now, do you think some sort of nutrient in the fruit and vegetable that is beneficial here? Or is it the fact that somebody who's eating an abundance of them is less likely to be eating an abundance of processed, unhealthy food? So is it really the fact that they're getting this, or is it the fact that they're not getting that?
It's a great question. And I think a lot of it may be that people are subbing out some of the bad stuff. But I would tell you that there is every time you eat a brightly colored fruit or vegetable, you're loading yourself up with a whole bunch of very important nutrients, including antioxidants, which neutralize a lot of the inflammation that's behind a lot of chronic disease. So my guess is it's a little bit of everything.
Oh yeah, man. I love me some. I am a fruit junkie. I've got some fresh nectarines in the fridge right now. I've got some fresh blueberries, some strawberries. I mean, it is game time. It is the summer season, and the farmers market is my jam, and they are all good. And I always get so happy in the morning when I have my oatmeal, and then I just put all kinds of colorful stuff on top of it, and it always tastes amazing. I'm never disappointed.
No, and that's exactly what I get people to realize. Think about this, right? If you can get fruit in the prime of its season, it's very inexpensive. Oatmeal is cheap as dirt, so you can eat a very nutritious, healthful, and filling and tasty breakfast, for $1 versus a bunch of junk that people buy from whatever stand they pass.
Oh yeah, let's hold on. You talk about inexpensive. Check this out. This was the haul from this past Saturday. All right, my wife and I got 6 ears of corn, 6 nectarines, a bunch of blueberries. We got a bunch of fresh green beans, and I believe and some potatoes. Right, so we got all of that for less than $20, and that was enough to feed us for 4 days. And it was just like, you want to talk about inexpensive and eating on a budget, man. You can take a family to McDonald's and blow $18 these days, no problem.
For sure. And that's what I try to get people to realize. I mean, beans and rice are as cheap as they get. Fresh fruit is great. Frozen fruit is even a better bargain, believe it or not. So there's no shortage of ways to do this. It's just people need to be creative. And especially if they're on a budget, you don't need to go to Whole Foods and get the fanciest star fruit imported out of season. Nobody needs that. I mean, you're welcome to it. It certainly is delicious, but you can eat local. You can get stuff that's fresh or frozen or dry and do well.
Nobody needs that. That just caught me off guard. That's funny. All right. Whole grains and diabetes. That was another study that is in your presentation. What did researchers find with that?
The truth is, as I mentioned, carbs are really not the enemy. It's the garbage carbs, the garbage, right, that people need to avoid, right? So, when you take a whole grain and mill it down into a Cheerio or a muffin or whatever it may be, you're going to end up getting rapidly absorbed sugars and carbs. So your goal really should try your best, if you can, to eat whole grains. And in fact, those who ate the most whole grains in a study of, hundreds of thousands of people that follow people for like 4.6 million person years, showed that overall those who ate the most had a third less diabetes risk compared to those who ate the least whole grains. And again, there are socioeconomic factors here, right? So people are eating, highly processed white carbs because they have a long shelf life, but they may end up hurting them in the long run. So we have to be smart about how we get people the food they need at prices that are affordable.
But hold up. So now you just talked about a Cheerio, but I believe if you look on the box of Cheerios, it'll say whole grain right on there. So clear up that confusion for us.
I actually, you can buy some of the magically delicious cereals too, and it says made with whole grains. And I always joke with my patients that there's a lot of gamesmanship that's going on in the food industry, right? My guess is when that box is about to close, somebody sprinkles in a few little whole grains, and they call it made with whole grains. And there are legal definitions as to what that actually needs to contain. But unless it says 100% whole grain and you recognize the ingredients as what they are, right? Oats, wheat groats, or whatever it may be, it's somewhat processed or very processed, depending on what you get.
All right, this next study is one that I got really excited about when I saw it. It has to do with soda. And when people drink diet soda, by and large, they're thinking that they're doing something good for themselves. They're thinking that this is the healthier option as opposed to going with the full sugar can of Coke. But back in November of last year, researchers actually looked at the two, put those head to head, and came up with some interesting findings. What were they?
Well, so it's actually not new. We all know that sugar-sweetened beverages, sodas, are bad news. They're associated with heart attack and stroke. And in the last couple of years, we've seen diet soda and artificially sweetened beverages also come under attack. There was a couple of studies last year that showed women in particular consume diet soda regularly were more likely to have stroke. So in this pretty amazing study that was done in the Journal of American College of Cardiology this last year, it doesn't matter if you eat sugar-sweetened or artificially sweetened beverages, people did worse So really the perfect beverage for human consumption remains water, or if you really want unsweetened tea, unsweetened coffee. But that's it. No juice, no soda, no diet soda, no artificially sweetened beverages. If you're drinking something that is just an unnatural color, it's probably artificially colored.
You mean that lime green Ecto Gatorade I used to drink back in the day wasn't good for me?
No, no, believe it or not, that's the thing. When people I'm like, have you ever seen a juice as neon red as that quote unquote fruit punch? No, of course not. So, people need to be careful. And, I would tell you in a lot of parts of our country, we refer to these sort of sugar sweetened beverages as either bug juice or Kool-Aid, even though it may not actually be Kool-Aid brand. And, people drink them as part of their, hanging out in the park or whatever it may be. But it is not good for us. Definitely not. And you can get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of calories that way.
It's unbelievable how quickly they add up. And it wasn't until after I lost weight that I actually looked at the nutritional information for Gatorade. And I was crushing two, like 32-ounce bottles of it on my way home from work as a snack, along with some other things from 7-Eleven. And that alone was a huge shot of calories that I had no business drinking. But again, at the time, I was like, this is Gatorade. This is what athletes drink. Of course it's good for me. Really not.
Right. Yeah. And for the record, people say, well, what about electrolyte containing beverages? Those are probably good if you are doing some very heavy work, outside in the sun or, running or working very hard sports wise. But I usually recommend the ones that are truly just electrolyte powders that you add to the water without the artificial gobbledygook and the sweeteners. There are some people out there who literally drink salt water, which has a similar effect, although not so tasty.
Yeah, we had Matt Frazier and Robert Cheek, who just put out the Plant-Based Athlete book a couple of weeks ago. They were talking about healthier Gatorade options. One of the ones that Matt was talking about was Datorade, which was a really simple concoction that people are fans of. I think it was just a date with maybe just a pinch of salt. That's the healthier thing for runners. The ordinary person who's sitting at their desk 9 to 5 probably isn't going to need Datorade.
Right.
But certainly that's a lot cleaner than the bottle of Gatorade that you'll find in your local 7-Eleven. Talked a little bit earlier about oatmeal and putting fruit on it. And another popular topping for oatmeal is cinnamon. And this was an interesting study that was put out recently that looked at the effect that cinnamon consumption has on blood sugar and glucose tolerance. What did researchers find with that?
So this is a small study. It was done in China, actually, where a lot of cinnamon is actually grown. Most people don't realize this, but cinnamon is actually tree bark. But it's ground up and it's really tasty. But in this group, they took people who had a cinnamon supplement, which was about 500 milligrams worth, and it actually improved their blood sugar levels and actually helped to drop their hemoglobin A1C, a measure of their sugar control over the last 3 months. Again, not new. Cinnamon has been around for a long time, not only as a condiment and a tasty way of flavoring foods, but also has been shown to have some impact on blood glucose control. And I just continue to tell people that having flavorful foods from a variety of plant sources always seems to do better, right? If you look, people are taking turmeric and curcumin supplements and all these things. But, if you eat Indian flavored food, curries and whatnot, you're going to get curcumin and turmeric in the food. So add cinnamon to food if you like it. And actually, there's a number of cultures that add it to their savory dishes too. If you ever go out for Moroccan food or others, that it's there and it's quite good.
Turmeric is clutch. Indian food is clutch. Curried anything is good. I'm a big fan. By the way, are you team turmeric or team turmeric?
I say turmeric, but it doesn't. To me, it doesn't. I understand what you're saying either way. Remember, I'm from New York originally, right? So the accent I grew up with was a very sort of intense accent. So now I'm much more neutral. So.
Absolutely. I don't think there's a wrong way to say it personally. Potato, potato. I don't care. The bottom line is the stuff is good for you. Let's not worry about how it is that we say it. We got a couple of more studies that I want to touch on really quickly. There was a big old meta-analysis that made your presentation here that looked at diet and mortality and lifespan. All right. So looked at, I think, 32 prospective cohort studies and 31 other meta-analysis. Combine that all for one big meta-analysis. What did they find as far as diet and mortality?
So it was interesting. First, we are obsessed with protein in the United States and many of the first world countries. And so, we're consuming loads of protein. And it did show that total protein intake did have 6% lower risk of all-cause mortality if you were in the higher group. And that may be more of a marker of diet quality, meaning if you have the resources to consume more protein, you may do better. Now, that said, a higher intake of plant-based protein was significantly associated with an 8% lower risk of all-cause mortality and 22% less cardiovascular mortality. So in short, if you're going to consume more protein, it ought to be plant-based protein.
Last study is one that was a topic that was brought up recently on the Exam Room Live. People wondering about the connection between their food and asthma. This is one that's going to be in there. What can we glean? What's the recent research on food and asthma?
Yeah, so remember, I work at a respiratory hospital, so we see a lot of folks with chronic respiratory conditions, including asthma. And I guess what I would tell you is this is also not new. There have been some very large studies over the years showing that asthma and diet are highly linked. And it turns out that asthma is an inflammatory condition, right? So if you put your body in an anti-inflammatory environment, it tends to do better. How do we treat asthma? We give people steroids, right? Massively potent anti-inflammatory drugs. So in this study, asthma has gone up as the obesity rates have gone up, particularly in westernized diets. But the diets that emphasize more fruits, vegetables, grains, and legumes and minimize the fat actually reduce the risk for asthma. And dairy has been shown particularly to worsen symptoms. And I've seen it personally, anecdotally speaking, that when I tell my asthmatics to go on a plant-based diet, because many of them are at risk or have coronary disease, their asthma gets better, which is always lovely to see. And then my pulmonary colleagues always raise an eyebrow at me because they can't believe it, but it really does work.
With the rates of obesity rising, are we seeing a correlation between that and asthma as well, or is that on the rise?
Yeah, so like I said, I think as obesity has gone up, I think the rates of asthma and difficulty breathing have gone up. We see a lot of this thing called obesity hypoventilation syndrome. So everyone seems to have some threshold and everyone's a little bit different. But when your weight goes up past a certain point, your lungs don't exchange gas very well. So many times we'll take care of a patient who has no intrinsic lung disease, but their body mass index is 40 or 50 and they're on oxygen because they're hypoventilating. Their lungs are not exchanging gas well.
Interesting.
And when they lose the weight, it goes away.
Interesting. Man, there's so much science there. Here's the deal, right? So what did we talk about here today? 1, 2, 3, bear with me as I count live. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So 12 studies. And that's not even a quarter of what it is you're going to be covering at the International Conference on Nutrition and Medicine. When I tell you that Dr. Freeman went all in for this and put hours and hours and hours worth of labor into this presentation, I'm not lying. We only scratched the surface here today. So you are going to be speaking Friday. What is it? Friday the 16th is when you are scheduled. So go ahead and register right now. pcrm.org/ICNM. That's the place to register. And just for exam room viewers, just for exam room listeners, there's a special code that you can enter to save $50. And that code is exam room. One word, exam room. Save $50 off the cost of registration, pcrm.org/ICNM. And there are going to be about 28, 29 other speakers there who are going to be covering all kinds of amazing science, all fact-based, all evidence-based, and it is just what you need to take your health IQ to the next level. And Dr. Freeman, I don't think anybody's going to cover as much as you are, man. This is I'm worn out just talking to you for the past 35 minutes. I can't imagine what your full presentation is going to be like.
Well, I think it'll be a lot of fun. I try to put a little humor in with everything. And I think, you'll leave with at least a concept of just how powerful and how much data there is. So I'm excited to share it with the ICNM crowd. And I sure hope to see many of you there.
You're a good man, and you can find a link to register as well in the episode notes in the show description below. Dr. Freeman, thank you so very much, my friend.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
If your health IQ is a couple of points higher than it was a few minutes ago, go ahead and like this video or subscribe to the YouTube channel. And to take it even higher, head over to Apple Podcast or wherever you get your favorite shows. Look for The Exam Room by the Physicians Committee. Hit the subscribe button there as well and help to make your world a healthier place.